Thanks for coming out to our annual Journalism Award luncheon. The Eugene Katz Award for Excellence in the Coverage of Immigration is named after Eugene Katz, who's a former board member of the Center for Immigration Studies. He retired from our board after his 90th birthday in '97 and passed away a few years later. We named it after him both because of his service to the center, but also because he had worked his whole career in media on both sides of the media business. He started out as a reporter, actually, at the Daily Oklahoman in the 20s, and after that moved over to work for the family business, which is now called, I believe, Katz Media Group or Katz Communications. It's a huge company no longer owned by the family, but his grandfather had started it in 1888 and was involved in selling radio ad time, that sort of thing, and spent his whole career there, so we thought it was especially appropriate to name a media award after Gene. We present this award not to promote any particular point of view, our own point of view or anybody else's, but really to recognize outstanding journalism on immigration topics and hopefully to foster more informed decision-making on an important issue like this. And unfortunately, much of the coverage of immigration, as many of you may be aware, ends up either being horse race stories about what congressman is pushing what bill and or state legislator, or human interest sob stories, often ginned up by advocacy groups and successfully placed with sympathetic reporters. And there's a place for that kind of thing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but there's often a paucity of straight news actually reporting facts that might be considered uncomfortable. I'll talk a little bit more about our recipient this year. Jackson Vanderbecken is his name. He's the cops and crime reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. But first, our keynote speaker will also talk about him and introduce Jackson a little bit to you. That's Deborah Saunders. She's a columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle. And a kind of, I don't know, what's the word? She's, I guess, the token. She's a token conservative at the San Francisco Chronicle. And I realized I didn't know this. She got her bachelor's degree at UMass Boston. So that's talking about jumping from the frying pan into the fire, from Boston to San Francisco. But I've always admired her writing, and she does address and come back to the immigration issue with some frequency, and I've always admired the soberness and incisiveness of her writing on the issue. So I'm going to have Deborah come up, give some thoughts about the issue in general and also about Jackson's writing, and then we'll get to Jackson. So, Deborah?
Greetings from the sanctuary city of San Francisco. I very much appreciate being invited here because Washington, of course, is home of all the big-time journalists, and here I am, a provincial from San Francisco who gets to come before you to the capital of journalism, where we sort of see aggressive, confrontational journalism, people speaking truth to power, at least until January 20. And as I was thinking about this award, I thought, you know, work in the business, and the San Francisco Chronicle is still in business. There are different kinds. Thank you. There are. A lot of people sort of look at journalism and think of it as being like Watergate, and it's very confrontational and aggressive. But in fact, there are certain beats that have tended to be pretty boosterish, where the reporters they're not anti-establishment, they're part of the establishment. Education would be an example, where a few years ago I started writing about math and reading curricula, whole language, where instead of kids learning how to decode words, they would be told to sort of absorb their meaning. New math, where kids didn't have to learn multiplication tables, the motto being there is no right answer. And I remember going back at time and thinking, well, what did people write about, these math light texts when they first came out? And of course, the education reporters would show up at a school where the curriculum committee had chosen these curricula, and you'd see these stories about there's this great new math program and the teacher and the kids love it. And a couple years later, parents start hiring tutors because their kids can't get into algebra. And the education beat reporters were the last to know. They were so into this thing. I mean, you'll see it in other ways too. Like when we talk about school funding, we often don't talk about how much we actually spend, or we leave out the federal amount or the local amount so that it seems less. And by the way, I got caught up in this too, because there was a time when some educators came to me and they showed me this thing, they called it the class test. And it was supposed to be a real higher level way of teaching. I love you.
I'm from California.
Okay. You know this. I can see this. So they showed us this thing, and they said, we're really trying to get to show the kids know how to think. And I wrote this thing, this is a great test, so I'm guilty. And then one day, this teacher sends me something that shows me how they taught educators how to grade the test. And they asked a simple math test. There's a fire, 3,000 trees are destroyed. Each kid gets 2 trees every day. One day, one kid plants 2 trees. Next day, 4 trees. Next day, 8 trees. How long does it take for the forest to be fixed? And by the way, of course, students have to plant the trees, not the Park Service. And it's all about, there's this whole environmental thing in the question. And the answer's 10.5 days. But this little girl, and you can tell she's a girl, said 450 days, and she got a higher test score than the kid who said 10.5 because he didn't have a little essay with a happy face. Remember, she said only 450 days. Another area of real booster reporting is the environment. If you look at medical issues, caffeine, wine. One day you read a story about how they're good for you, the next you read a story about how they're not. Global warming, I mean, if the only stories that papers tend to print on global warming it's the end is near or it doesn't make the paper. And I'll just give one other example. When you read stories that talk about the late Michael Crichton, they don't mention he's a doctor. He's a novelist. Al Gore, Nobel Prize winner, right? So, and then there's immigration. Now, for a lot of people who cover the immigration beat, the story is, well, Nancy Pelosi's view, I think, would sort of pass for their view. And that is that everybody who is an immigrant is good, and I think most people are, by the way. But enforcement of the laws are bad, and they're always bad. This is sort of amazing because these laws, I believe, were passed. Now, I'm just from San Francisco, folks, but they were passed by Congress. But we often seem to treat them as if they came from outer space. And so the stories that Jackson Vanderbecken has written about, and I'm sure you're aware of them, that has to do how the sanctuary city policy in San Francisco was gamed by MS5. MS13 was gamed. I'm thinking of MI5. Was how the sanctuary policies in San Francisco were gamed by a drug cartel, and it sort of made San Francisco not a sanctuary for law-abiding people. This is a story that no immigration reporter would ever uncover. It took a crime reporter like Jackson to see what was going on. And basically that MS-13, somebody there had figured out, hey, they've got this stupid sanctuary city policy, so if you're caught selling crack in the Tenderloin, just say give them a phony name, say you're 16, you can have a beard, you can a full beard, and there's nothing they can do. That's exactly what happened. And by the way, and what did San Francisco do? Well, they didn't hand you over to the federal immigration officials because, of course, they're evil. No, they flew you back to Honduras or El Salvador or wherever. Do not stop. Sort of do not go to jail. Go directly to go. And after that policy was discredited, they started sending people to halfway houses with no security so that the drug dealers could just show up for a couple days and skip town and get back to San Francisco. This policy was not good for Tony Bologna, who was shot. He's age 48 with his two sons, Michael and Matthew, age 16. The man who's been arrested has not been tried, was someone who had been arrested by San Francisco authorities for assault for a man on a bus in 2003, for assaulting a pregnant woman in 2004, and he was free last year, and he's now being charged with these murders. A little boy named Ivan Miranda was knifed, nearly beheaded, killed by another person who was a beneficiary. Well, the person who was charged in this case was a beneficiary of the Sanctuary City program. And I can only say that San Francisco has now changed the policy, and they are now cooperating with ICE officials when they catch people doing it. And since Jackson's story started running, they figured out that 30% of the people who had said that they were minors were adults. I've worked for two newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Los Angeles Daily News, and Jackson Vanderbecken has worked at both of them, and he's always just been one of those great reporters who will go after a story no matter what. He's a relentless reporter, and he, I think, should be the ideal of what reporters do, and that's why I'm so thrilled that he is getting this award today. Thanks, Mark Corian, for asking me to come here.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. That's a better intro for Jackson than I could have done. Jackson, if you could come up. This is the 2009 Eugene Katz Award for Excellence in the Coverage of Immigration. I'll hold it up for all the people to see. And in fact, engraved on it is what I just said, the 2009 Eugene Katz Award for Excellence in the Coverage of Immigration. There you go, and there's a check that comes with that, too. Thank you. There you go, thank you.
Thank you very much. When I started to do these stories, San Francisco is a different kind of place. And it turns out it had its own foreign policy, as many of you know, and part of its foreign policy that it wasn't part of the United States of America. In that, if a kid was caught committing an offense or allegedly committing an offense, they would decide that they weren't, even though they knew he wasn't here illegally, or he was here illegally or wasn't here legally. It was amazing that they filled out the form, and a lot of these kids were from Honduras for some strange reason. I mean, why they wound up there, apparently somebody got the word that it was okay to come here and nothing was going to happen. So when they filled out their form, they always said, 14 Unknown Street, Honduras. Or else they gave an address in Oakland, which turned out to be a house where a lot of them all lived, and they all claimed to have relatives. Sometimes they're the same people. And matter of fact, one guy, see, one of the things of the probation officers who are supposed to be the people who are trying to rehabilitate these folks, they would call. And in one case, one uncle answered, and he said, "Hi. Oh, yeah, I remember him. Yeah. I'm his uncle. But I don't know anything about him." And then they called back an hour or 2 hours later, and they got another guy who said, yeah, I'm his uncle too. And so what happened was, why this story ended up happening is that a lot of people became frustrated over a lot of years, and it turned out that they had this policy dates back to the 1990s, and no one was going to, in San Francisco, it's not like something you want to raise attention to, that they had basically made this sort of an agreement amongst themselves that they weren't going to report youths caught committing offenses to the ICE folks, or before it was the INS. And so one of the things that happened after the story started running is they said, hey, wait a minute, we had this agreement. We really did. We talked to these guys back in 1996, and they basically agreed that this was okay, that we don't have to turn these folks over to ICE. We can just basically treat them as if they're U.S. citizens, and if they commit offenses, they'll be entitled to the same treatment as folks that are here legally. The trouble was with that whole premise is that the people that came here from Honduras, they had no relatives here. They had no one. They were basically brought here, they called unaccompanied minors. And there was no one minding the store. If they were youths, there was no one supervising them. They had no one to turn them over to. So they had to keep them locked up because they had no place to, they knew that the putative relatives weren't their relatives. So they kept them in juvenile hall, and they were there day after day, waiting for something to happen, and finally they would plead guilty, or the equivalent thereof in the juvenile system, and then they had to figure out, well, what do we do with them? That's when they hit upon the idea of flying them back to their native country. Now, it wasn't a matter of deporting them, because they didn't want to report them to ICE. So they had to use probation officers as basically escorts. So they put them on planes, and they would go as far as Texas or Florida, and then they would go back to Honduras, or the original country that they were from. Then they'd come right back. Or if they didn't come back, there was no supervision of them, so no one knows what ended up happening. But when they did come back, it became this horrible frustration for folks. So one of the reasons that generated this story was that people just didn't understand how this could keep going, and how this system could keep going on for so long. And there were people that were trying to call attention to it, and they would go to the judges or the commissioners in the youth system, and they'd say, how can you do this? This is illegal. We have to report these folks to ICE. And they'd say, you do that, you'll be in big trouble. And they didn't. And but they were so frustrated by it, they ended up coming to me. So that tells you how truly frustrated these folks are. It took more than a decade. Involving, I don't know how, one kid, the story goes, one probation officer turned him over, and they found out about it. So not only did they get the probation officer in trouble, they spent tens of thousands of dollars to get the kid back. Nobody knows how much, because none of this information is public. I don't know who this kid is to this day, but I have been told that they spent that guy got in a lot of trouble. He ended up quitting. And they ended up got a lot of lawyers' fees, paying to get the kid back from which country, I don't remember if it was Honduras or El Salvador. But anyway, they finally got him back. But that was part of the lore of this thing, because it's not exactly they keep records. And the other thing is that because these kids are mostly juvenile offenders in the system, we couldn't go to court. We didn't have any, I had to rely on people who were prepared to break the law. Although sending them back without reporting to ICE theoretically was also breaking the law. But anyway, the people would be able to give me their records. So we could see how many times that Mr. Ramos, who was is now charged with killing 3 family members of the Bologna family, he had benefited not once but twice. And matter of fact, I subsequently heard that he was Youth of the Year as part of one of the programs that were designed to assist, and there was a whole entire network of people that were relying on this not deporting these kids, because they had to be housed. They had no supervision, no adult supervision. So they created this whole thing where they learned, they got cultural training. I'm not quite sure what that was, but they housing, medical care, probation officers had to take them to medical appointments. I mean, and so you had a whole, on the other hand, I could talk about this for a little longer than I should. On the other hand, you had this entire group of folks who came storming to my newspaper, who traditionally held sway when it came to issues like this involving journalists. See, I'm not part of that. I cover crime. See, I got nothing to do with that. They don't know me. They're mad at me. They don't know who to talk to. They're all their friends. You know, they pick up the phone and go, hey, why are you guys writing all these stories? Can't you stop this? I mean, I'm serious. We want to meet with you. We really do. And I said, well, you can meet with me, but I understand your point of view that a lot of these kids are exploited. They're brought here by drug cartels who take advantage of the fact that San Francisco is a sanctuary for Honduran drug dealers. It's okay. I mean, I understand that these kids are exploited, and as one activist said in a meeting, these kids just want to make money. And this is the best way. And I was like, okay, I can't do that if I'm an American citizen coming to court and say, I robbed the bank because I just wanted to make money. I'm just floored. I mean, it just, but, you know, and everybody sits there and they go, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, this is not the world that I'm used to. I cover crime in courts. And unfortunately, there is one negative element to this in the sense that these folks have a point that under the federal immigration rules, it doesn't matter whether Junior committed the offense or not. He's back. He's gone. So if for some reason somebody gets caught wrongly accused of a crime, and that does happen, they get deported anyway. And so, you know, but the vast majority, I would say, admit the offense very quickly because they get freed. They were freed when they committed the offense. If they just said, yeah, I did it, they would go back to their little this little house they had, this phony house in Oakland where they could live and make a lot of money. And when they sent them down, they sent them all the way down to San Bernardino County, which is all the way down to the bottom of the state almost. A long way from San Francisco, over 500 miles, I think. In any event, they come right back. They'd be back in a week. Because there's no way to make money in San Bernardino. They could make a lot of money in San Francisco. Anyway, so that's what this story was. And what I think the interesting thing is that, in a sense, I agree with Deborah Saunders because I don't think that immigration reporters were going to cover this story. It just wasn't something that because they have to presuppose that people here are here because they're exploited and they're here to seek a better life. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, people come here for all sorts of reasons, but my view as a crime reporter, my bias is that typically if you're responsible for a crime, the idea of the system is that you should be held responsible for it. In any event.
Thank you. Here, wrap that up in there. Keeps it nice.
Thanks.
Thank you, folks. I'll respect people's time. People got to get back to work, although it is Friday and it's raining, and I'm not sure anybody really wants to do any work. So if you want to stay and if there's any food out there, finish it off, feel free. But thank you for coming, and we'll see you next year, I hope, at our next award. Thanks a lot.